Paper, yeah.
Good evening, everyone. We'll call the meeting to order and start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Roll call, please.
Chairperson Brightcoff,
Here.
Commissioner Blaylock,
Here.
Commissioner Greditor, Commissioner Levin, Commissioner Marshall, Commissioner Romanelli, here, and Commissioner Rothbart.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. First order of business is the approval of the minutes from February 1st, 2024. I'll entertain a motion. Okay, second?
Second. Oh, he's got it.
All right.
He's got it.
Steve made the motion, and I think Mike seconded it.
Yeah, he seconded it. Yeah.
Any discussion? Any changes, comments?
Carl? No kidding.
Nope.
No.
All right, we will, all in favor, thank you. Any opposed? All right, they passed, thank you very much. Next, visitors wishing to address the Plan Commission.
Got a lot of visitors.
Would our visitors have any? No, not at this time, okay. No new business, old business, continued discussion of plan developments. I will turn to our illustrious Director of Community Services to take us into this discussion, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the fact that you think that I'm going to lead you through this. However, Lee Brown of Tesca Associates is actually tasked tonight to do that for us. So he has a list of things that we're going to look at, and we're still at a high-level discussion. We're not ready yet to start crafting ordinance language, but our intent is that we hopefully gather enough information from tonight's meeting that it will get us able to dive into doing that so that we can get a rough draft put together ASAP. So with all of that said, I'll turn it over to Mr. Brown.
It's a pleasure to see you all. I'm going to work off the outline that I hope was in your packet.
You need an extra copy?
Okay.
This thing here? I think,
The intent of this is to present some structure that ultimately you will be satisfied includes the right kinds of standards to evaluate a development against. So we start with the purpose statement, which is to a considerable extent your ability to leave breadcrumbs to the next plan commission or to future decision makers when development occurs. You will have explained to them what your original intent was in establishing the plan unit development or plan development ordinance. We titled this predominantly residential plan development because as we understand it, the opportunities that are likely to occur before you, your comprehensive plan leads you to try to direct them towards predominantly residential uses on these sites. We're not going to name the sites necessarily, but we're going to describe at some point in this process, where are we aiming this at? And that's actually a decision that comes down what we called applicability and thresholds, and we'll get to that in a second. But we wanted to make the statement up front that this is intended to be a tool to authorize residential development that is excellent, yet is not at the traditional 1 acre density that you have for the rest of the village. So what allows us to do that and assure that there is excellence in the design? So we have a series of statements about what we're intending development to make use of this tool in order to get there. I think I need to take a step back for a second and say, why is there planned unit developments or planned development ordinances in the first place? And they really come out of the 1940s when the character of subdivision development, which was the post-war means of subdividing property and building residential neighborhoods, led to what was considered at the time a lot of monotonous and excessive streets and improvements that were expensive and unattractive. And someone said, there's a way of doing this that preserves natural character, that induces a much higher level of design, but you can't do that with a traditional zoning requirement that has rigid setbacks from the front yard, rigid setbacks from the side yards, et cetera. And they said, if we brought to you the ability to look at a large area, and at the time, many of these were 40 or 120 acre areas, if I brought this to you as a well-designed, planned area, we can make up standards that emphasize the open space, emphasize the public spaces that weren't necessarily just the right-of-way itself. And they put together this process by which, if you create a really good plan, you can deviate from what would have been the standards of traditional subdivision and zoning. That doesn't always translate today. Unfortunately, what happens in many cases is that every community adopts a PD ordinance or standards, and it becomes the tool by which the developers wrestle with the community as to what their design can be to avoid the problems they're having with the ordinance, with the standard zoning ordinance, which is to say, they think it's a get out of jail free ordinance. What that diminishes is the potential for having exceptional design. It doesn't, what it means is that if there is this ordinance put in place, then the developer simply needs to meet these minimum standards and they get to do what they want to do. That's not our intent here. Our intent is to use this to elevate design, to enhance the character of these areas, and do it in a way that it can be approved by measuring how well they meet a set of standards, rather than a rigid set of, if I get this far, you're going to give me the rest of it. So, with that said, I think it's important that the statement of purpose is very clear why we're doing this. And so it includes things like, well, it meets the intent of the comprehensive plan. It fits the character and the already established high quality of life in the community. It respects the environment. It strengthens neighborhoods and a sense of community, or establishes its own neighborhood and sense of community. It enhances diversity of residential types so that we have not just the 1 acre single-family home separate. It provides opportunities where we don't currently have them. Importantly, F is protects woodlands and wetlands. We want to make sure that the fundamental character of this community, which is built around those things, is fundamental to any new development. Integrates necessary parking, doesn't stipulate precisely what that number is in the purpose statement, but recognizing that some parking, and that's not just the residents, but also visitors, et cetera, needs to be provided. Accommodates vehicular, bicycle, and pedestrian access. Minimizes demand on limited public resources and public services, and incorporates natural and built design elements to enhance the village unique character. The paragraphs or paragraph that sets those out in that purpose statement, we hope then we will build on those in the rest of the document. So the next thing that we think is necessary is, where should this be used? Because one of the things that we're not encouraging is someone assembling 4 or 8 or 10 single-family homes in the middle of Riverwoods to try to create some entirely new development by doing that. And so it's likely that there's a couple of ways of doing that. One, literally on the comprehensive plan, we can indicate eligibility, right? We can say these are areas that we think in advance make sense for them to be planned as a unit. Other ways of doing it is similar to the Thorngate ordinance, which said a minimum area to be considered and adjacency to certain types of roadways. That's how they identified the special nature of the golf course that became Thorngate development. But somehow we need to focus on properties that are different from the rest of the main part of the community. So whether that's access on Lake Cook or access on Deerfield, because we think those heavily traveled roads have more of an ability to absorb what these developments could be. Or we simply go back to that issue of putting it on the comprehensive plan and amending the plan to identify those.
So I think if I could
Jump, please.
If I can maybe interject and just build on what you're saying, is that if we look at this by location, by saying that the properties that are subject to the PUD are those properties that have access to the main streets that are going through and around the village, it prevents the combination of lots in the middle of a neighborhood, and then we don't have to worry about that aspect of it.
That's what I wanted to be clear about.
Okay.
This is not intended to be used all about the community. This is special sites. And we can, if appropriate, if we think it's appropriate, say that there's a minimum lot area to be considered, right? But it's probably something bigger than, 10 acres or more, something like that, that you think can essentially stand on its own to have its own character, as opposed to having to, if it was a 2-acre site on Deerfield Road, I don't think that that's what we're aiming at for this use, okay? There is something that the village attorney and I still are working out, and that is sort of the technical application of whether this becomes a standalone district or it's an overlay over an existing district. I don't want to get into that tonight. It will have an effect on the way we write it, but ultimately the standards are going to be the same. But in either case, it's likely that you're going to have some uses that you would accept as, without question, these can fit in this type of development. Single-family homes, maybe 2-family homes, maybe multifamily homes that you would consider if the multifamily is, let's say, 8 units or less, or some other standard, right? The question is, are there uses that you would say, under certain circumstances, we can allow? What would be, let's say this is titled predominantly residential plan development, but if you had 40 acres and 38 of them were residential, but 2 acres were a small convenience retailing site on a primary roadway, but well designed as a group of uses, maybe the commercial use is a special use approved only if it can physically be done in this very attractive way, or we're not going to allow mixed uses at all. So what we want to have some feedback tonight is whether or not there are uses, one, that you obviously think are going to fit some of these sites, and you're not going to have a question about the use. Layout, yes. Site design, yes, but not the use. In the middle, are there some that have the nature that they might work, if you can show us that they're going to work, versus the ones over here which you're never going to allow? So I'm going to take a pause for a second. I want you to think about that. Thorngate was a planned development of single-family uses, single-family detached buildings. Let's use it as an example. Can you imagine that there might have been some 2-unit buildings side by side? They looked sort of like single-family units, just bigger with 2 doors out front. You saw some of those on your tour. I think you said some of those were attractive. Would you put that in the permitted bucket or the special bucket?
Question being, permitted or special, to what extent? In other words, I would have no objection to an attractive, well-designed duplex mingled with other things. Does that make it a special use or a permitted use? And I don't know what the difference is specifically.
If it's simply a question of the layout on the site, I would say you're not challenging the use, you're just saying we have to apply good site design standards, and you're going to do that in any case. But if you said that if the site is directly adjacent to residential, or at least, let's say, a portion of the site is directly adjacent to existing single-family homes, then it would be you have to meet a higher level of standard to allow for 2-family or townhome units adjacent to single-family.
I have a question. A couple questions, actually. First of all, when you talk about enhances diversity of residential types opportunities, can you expand on that, what that actually means?
To the extent that I understand you have nothing but single-family detached homes in the community, with the exception of the senior, which I'm not calling residential for the moment. It's commercial. Because it's a commercial use. Anything that adds to that one type enhances opportunities for other living. So, two-family units, I'm not talking about ownership, I'm only talking about the type of building.
Sure, sure. And then a follow-up, we had talked about this too, and I think it was called housing, what was that called? When we talked about like a percentage of it had to be affordable housing. Is that fall into this category as well when we're looking at this?
No, the use is the same. It's a question of how it is funded or how expensive it is to own or rent that unit.
Okay.
So we're not, it's unlikely that we're going to have a separate question or standard in here related to affordable housing. The village is likely to need a separate affordable housing ordinance, and any development is going to have to meet that ordinance.
Okay, okay, thank you.
I have a question. Just thinking about single family, you talk about ownership. There's a number of communities that are being built because of the demand for single family rental. Would we
Well, that's a good idea.
want to talk about that? Would we allow a developer to build single family that would only be
55 and
rented
over?
versus owned?
55 and over you're referring to? Is it 55 and over?
No.
Just regular, okay.
There's
Okay.
single families
Okay.
that don't want to purchase, but they want a single family.
Okay,
We consider ownership not a zoning, you don't have the control through zoning to control whether a building is owner-occupied or owned, but rented by one family. The building is a one-family unit, or it's a two-family unit, or it's a townhouse with 8 units, and whether someone is on the inside who owns it or rents is not part of zoning. So you get the concept of permitted, special, prohibited. Let's keep moving, but I think what you'll see is when we draft something, there's going to be a list of permitted, potentially special, potentially prohibited, right? Prohibited includes industrial and, all kinds of things that you don't want anywhere in the community, right?
I think it'll be good to see those potential lists so we can get some idea of what we're talking about,
Yeah.
what the spectrum is.
I'll telegraph my suggestion will start with that something that exceeds 4 or 8 units in a building becomes a special set of standards. If it's a building that has an outside appearance of being at the scale of many of the homes in the village, that sense of, well, it's 4 units, that's about the limit of what you would say is the same sort of scale of other, there's some really big houses in the community that, from a square foot standpoint, they probably could be 4 units. But what I'm saying is at some point, it's clearly a different kind of building type. For instance, if it was a mid-rise, in a condo, meaning ownership, if it starts to go into 3 stories, it's special. It would be a special condition that you would say, show us that you meet these additional standards. So what kinds of standards are we talking about building into this? Again, think of it as being we want to have the ability for these uses to respect the natural conditions that are on the ground. And this is a fallacy of our planning, which is that the more it is individual units, the more there are driveways and parking spaces and yards that take up physical space for each unit, that has a tendency to be applied to particularly wooded sites in a way that we lose wooded value. It's easier to cluster buildings and leave larger wooded properties by them, in their natural condition. And so many communities will recognize, in order to get value out of the site and still protect it, they will allow for greater height than if it is a single-story, single-family home that takes up a larger footprint. So there's a trade-off. One, you get height, which, if it's on the periphery of these sites, has an impact off-site. If it's in the center of the site, often you don't notice the height of the structures. So there's going to be some standard in terms of what's allowable in height. You already have that in your existing zoning districts. Setbacks, separations, and buffer yards. Well, you already have buffer yards in the ordinance. But if you can imagine that the ordinance typically has a front yard setback from a roadway. It often has side yard setbacks. It often has rear yard setbacks, so that you can't put, particularly principal buildings, sometimes you're allowed to be in those setbacks for accessory structures like a garage. But in the case of a planned unit development, what often happens is buildings are allowed to be closer to each other without having setbacks defined by lot lines that don't exist. So if you can imagine a site that's 40 acres in size, we may not see any additional lots subdivided within that area. It may be one lot and, let's just say, 40 dwelling units that, depends how it's done, whether there's a lot, a fee simple lot underneath that dwelling unit, or they just have common area.
Question.
Yes.
So I think of this, in Glenview, if you know where Milwaukee, kind of before Central, it's right by App, there's this area that has all these houses in the area, and I think they're called urban, I think that's what they call it, and these houses are really close together. It's actually very annoying, because when you're too close, you've got your neighbors really, really close. I would think that that's probably not a good idea, and when you say close, we have to define what close means, because this is really too close, to be very honest with you. That's just my personal opinion.
Yes, there will always be it's too close, for many reasons, one of which is fire separation, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that some of the places we asked you to visit on the tours didn't have lot lines. They had buildings that were reasonably separated. I'm looking at Fox Meadows as being one that I think you had some positive reaction to. One of the things that is not uncommon these days is zero lot lines, which allows a building to be right on the property line so long as there's a separation between it and the next building, right? So our standards in a planned unit development may allow for moving without looking at rectangular lots that have individual buildings on them. And so it's really hard to have front yard setbacks if you don't have lot lines, right? It's really hard to have side yard setbacks, but you can stipulate separation between buildings. And in the case of the entire 40 acres, I keep using that as an example, I have no idea where that is in town, but let's say there's this 40 acres. On the periphery, you may not have front yard setbacks, but you may definitely want to have buffer areas.
I think one of the things that you have to think about
I found this on the web.
is I didn't find this one on the web, is that, Lee's talking about size of house, maybe there's multiple homes that are connected, not necessarily just 2 units, could be 3 units, could be more units, but part of what you get in looking at the PD where you're doing that level of density is you're working on conserving open space. Too often, some of these developments, and I think the previous Lexington was a classic example, that we're going to try to maximize the footprint of buildings at the detriment to the open space design on a property. There is a line between that and what we look for in the more excellent design that takes into account, and you've seen it on the tours, where there were a lot that had multiple. There were sometimes up to 6 homes next to each other, but it didn't feel that way because of the open spaces that were created. Maybe it was kind of like, not necessarily a pocket park, but a little island park where the streets went around. People had opportunities. There were gazebos and there are areas where, people could congregate. Not necessarily owned by any particular person. Sometimes when you get into the multifamily levels, you give up that kind of right that suburbia's looked for in buying a single family home. But you also have an opportunity to create different things, save the woodlands, create more woodlands, be a little more creative with water features and things like that, that enhance the neighborhood and make it desirable for people to live there. And some of the communities that we looked at on the tours, I think they nailed it. Tighter homes, but they had a lot of open space that you can enjoy as you're driving through, walking through.
Let me double down on that. I'm going to skip past C and go to D, which is minimum usable open space requirements. And I think that there's a big difference between open space and usable open space. And I was, one of our staff critiques of the Lexington development was that the open space was simply a separation between buildings. It wasn't necessarily something that a human would use, that they would sit out on a chair or enjoy an afternoon in the sun. It was just because they couldn't get the buildings any closer, so they might as well put grass there. I don't mean to.
Why don't you just build another Thorngate?
So there's again, I think there's a difference between open space and having open space that is available, accessible, and usable. Which is to say that you can build an open space which is a stormwater detention area, and it may not be usable. And I want to make that distinction, because I'm saying there may be a criteria that says you got to meet the stormwater standards, but that doesn't count towards usable open space. Now, if you ring that stormwater detention area, if you shape the stormwater detention area in a way that has an appeal that looks like a pond, right? That it's not a dry basin, it has a pond, and there's a walking and, a pathway around it with some seating, suddenly you can make use of that space and it has more value. Okay, so I'm going to go backwards and talk about lot coverage and impervious surface. Impervious surface is any surface that doesn't let water move through it into the ground. We can get super technical about whether pavers are impervious or not. They have to be constructed in a way that water moves in between pavers, right? And also has to be maintainable so that in year 4, when all the dirt goes into those cracks, they're still allowing water to go through. So without getting into too much detail on that, roofs, sidewalks, driveways, parking areas, pathways that are paved are all impervious. They don't let water move through the surface into the ground. There is good site design and good stormwater management and good character development where we don't cover all of the site with impervious surfaces. I don't know, I don't think you've got impervious surface limits in the rest of the community.
Not in the R1, R2.
Lot coverage is a separate measure than impervious surface. Lot coverage focuses on buildings that cover the ground.
I believe that in the past, we've gone when houses are in for development, and one of the things we look at is the amount of impervious in driveways or tennis courts or swimming pools, as well as the foundation of a house when we go to permit that house, so that there won't be excessive runoff to the neighbors. And I think that's in the ordinance somewhere, but darned if I know where.
So we include them in a planning or development to give the developer flexibility on how they manage stormwater on the site, so long as they meet our stormwater runoff standards and detention standards, et cetera. But in many cases, that means that they engineer the site in a way that handles the stormwater but isn't particularly supportive of the natural environment around them. The recharge of aquifers, the natural reduction of when you create a stormwater basin that has an outflow off-site that eventually makes it to the plains or whatever hits those impervious surfaces has to go off-site eventually, which is an eventual load into our system. But if you allow for more of the site to not be covered with impervious surface, you are allowing more water to stay on the site. An interesting side point, the city of Chicago is sinking because the surfaces below the city are compressing because they're not getting enough water in them. Enclosed parking, guest parking, and accessibility. I think good design avoids open parking lots, both for the fact that they are impervious surfaces, and they are extensive and have a tendency to transmit a character of asphalt and cars. Better design hides the cars, makes the buildings and the architecture and the landscape the feature of the community, not the storage of our vehicles. So wherever possible, we would prefer to have covered parking, whether that's in a garage or underground or somehow we don't have to look at it. We recognize that we need to accommodate visitors. That parking is probably more likely to be exposed and not necessarily in your garage. We had a concern of a recently but unnamed development where in order to go from the guest parking, which was behind the garage, to the front door, you got to walk around the building. There were no human doors on the garage side. I think our ordinance should try to avoid that. That's an accessibility question. So then we ultimately want to make sure that we set measurable standards that try to address that list of things you saw and liked when you went on tour. Some of them are going to have to be judgment about good design because we can't necessarily anticipate, we can't necessarily include a rule that says the distance, that from every parking space you can see the front door or those kinds of things. So the ordinance will identify those things, particularly the high priority issues in terms of views into open space. Considerable amount of landscaping to soften the character of buildings. It can address building materials that are consistent with other building materials in the community, or it can stipulate explicitly we're not going to allow certain kinds of plastic siding or some list of materials that are not traditional to the community or attractive, that from your perspective, block walls are not an attractive building material. I mean, what's the concrete block walls?
Concrete block. Probably want to look at things that are going to stand the test of time as well, too. And today, and all of a sudden your development is outdated 2 years from now.
Steve is indicating that one of the questions about materials is its longevity or its maintainability. And that and beauty aren't always in the same material. So we have to be careful that we're picking attractive materials that can be maintained. So here I'm I'm moving down to, let me stop and ask if there are questions. Okay. Item 5 is public benefit. Back in those 1940s and 50s when they first developed planned development, it was incumbent upon the developer to show that this was not just for the benefit of the developer to get around the rules, but there was inherent in this a public benefit to doing it this way, whether that was because they had substantially more open space on the site, or they had the protection of certain environmental conditions, or they built in a public playground for residents, or they might have had a whole list of things that were considered over and above just, you're letting me subdivide and build these buildings. And the question I think we should muse about is whether or not we're going to say, if you give us something more than the minimum standards here, is there a bonus? Or is there a threshold that if you don't have these public improvements like an open space that's accessible, we're not going to approve the planned development? But what if they do provide open space, and on top of it they've got a tot lot, or they make their tennis courts available to the community, or I'm thinking about the protection of woodlands over and above the minimum. Is that 90% of?
You can do up to 20%.
20%. So what if they maintain 100% of the woodlands. Should they get extra credit? And then what is the credit we're giving them? And therein lies this, if we have standards on the total number of dwelling units per acre density, right? Do they get a bonus for that?
I'm going to answer something here. So in thinking about what you're saying, you know, we've had so many people come in here and try to give us what they want, and here's this, and here we are talking about this, and I like what we're doing, trust me, but when we think about it, we haven't had anyone even hit our standards yet. So how do you go about that?
If they're not hitting your standards, you shouldn't be approving the development. The trouble we have often is that if this is not a plan unit development and it is purely a permitted use, the standards are pretty common, pretty low. And as long as they meet that, you can't say no, right? If they meet the standards of a permitted use, whether that's setbacks or density or whatever, or lot sizes, et cetera, you can encourage better site design, but you can't really say no to the subdivision itself.
When it comes to bonuses, it really has to be something that is an excellence point. It can't just be any old extra thing that they throw in there that they don't have to do. To me, it's got to be something that advances the excellence of the project. So I would be very interested in what we can come up with there.
I'm turning it to you because I want to know what's really important to you that you would say if they get above some minimum standard, we're going to start saying that they're doing an excellent job.
Well, I would say certain sustainability or environmental aspects, if they go geothermal, if they go solar, if they go EV charging, I mean, those kinds of things, which we haven't even started to.
Those are great.
Yeah, those I would like to see, and those would be bonus points, in my opinion,
Those
if
are
it's
all-
done right.
Those are all really great, and I think maybe one way to look at it is, Carrie, I understand the comment that you made, but it's not like we've had a flood of developments to judge the ordinance against. Everybody, it got to a point where obviously the previous development didn't happen. So maybe what this exercise leans toward is take a real hard look at that development and let us know where they fell short in your mind. What would it have taken to get that over the edge to a point where it could be approved? Maybe it's issues like the chair says, but maybe it's, you know, more integrated open space. That design just had one building after another, after another, after another. And like Lee was saying, there really wasn't usable open space between. It's like you're sandwiched in, and it's, you know, it's, it might as well been like Cabrini Green, for crying out loud, to look out and see your neighbor 5 feet away. You know, there could have been some creativity on placement of buildings. You know, maybe one building is this way, another here, so you get this little pocket or something in there. That's the type of thing that I think we need feedback from the commission as far as where did you think that it fell short? An item or two that might be something that we start looking at possibly could be bonus items. Certainly sustainability, you know, is a great aspect. You know, maybe the building needs to meet, you know, some of the criteria that you would do for LEED design, but maybe not. You know, sometimes that puts the price tag of a project out of the question, depending on how the economics are going at the point in time. But nonetheless, it's still a goal. You know, would a green roof be a good thing to put in? You know, not many people are going to see the green roof, but you can tout the fact that I've got this thing and we're contributing to the environment by cooling down the project because we don't have, you know, black roofs that are, you know, the sun's beating and warming up the whole community. Those are the type of things that I think that we're searching for.
Well, I think that from this exercise, and this is how I judge this, is we are now saying, here's what we want before someone comes in here. So we're pre-planning now, which I think is a lot better than just having someone and come and talk to us. And I think that's what's good about this. So by doing this, I think this is much better because now we have an idea of what we want. Someone comes in, oh, that doesn't fit this, or this does, and then we know where to go with that.
Couple things. First one is, and this has been brought up and laid down so many times that it's got flatness on its bottom already, which is the question of an appearance review commission. Many of our adjacent towns do have them for housing. Bannockburn, for example, has a very strong one. And I think that putting in some kind of an appearance review to work with a potential developer saying, hey, if you're going to do this in chocolate brown stained wood, over height, too close together, there we go, appearance review says this is not going to fly. If we have some standards that we can present to people who come in, and eventually somebody's going to come in and want to develop these sites. You know, it may not be tomorrow and it may not be, and please the Lord, it should be long enough for us to come up with an ordinance so that we've got something to show them as to this is what we would like to see on that site and how close can you come to that, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the outcome of this entire exercise.
I believe that we would be building in what amounts to appearance review. But appearance review doesn't work unless there is standards to which you can measure. Where communities simply give a group of architects and landscape architects free rein to decide what they would like versus what the developer has brought to them, that is not an appropriate exercise of appearance review.
No, and I've seen it abused a couple times. A friend of mine who was building a house, and the original plans had a nice round oriel window on the staircase, and when they put it in, they put a rectangular window in because the architect said, you're going to have problems with this round window. And they were stopped from completing the building of the house because the village that they were in wanted a nice round oriel window, and it wasn't there anymore. And on that tiny, so it can be ludicrous. There's no question about it. But it would seem to me that if we come up with a rational group of standards as to what we would find pleasing within our community, and before a developer spends $7 million laying out designs and doing engineering, have him have something he can look at to give him an idea of what would or might be acceptable in the village, I think that would save us a whole lot of battle further in the future.
We can hope that the developer looks at it before they spend millions of dollars on engineering.
And what do they say, dream on?
Okay, I don't know that you need to spend a whole lot of time with this, but we think there are some very standard approaches to making this workable for both the developer and the community, and that is the sort of predictability of the process itself, which starts with a pre-application discussion with staff who can lay out the things in advance and say, these are things that the Plan Commission and the Village Board will be looking for. Hopefully that's done before they've spent enormous amounts of money on engineering, et cetera. At some point, we hope that they put it together well enough that it is in its conceptual form and understandable, and then we would say as staff, it's ready to go to the Plan Commission for conceptual review. We would encourage a developer to have contact with nearby neighbors in a forum that allows them to have discussions before we get to a formal public hearing process on these. They can take that recommendation or not. We don't typically make that a requirement, but we make it a recommendation. Then comes a very formal look at the way they meet the standards as the staff, see them, and we make a complete staff report that identifies the characteristics that are consistent or inconsistent with the standards. And importantly, that they have prepared their documents and put their application in and paid their fee, and it is now ripe for public review. So the staff acts essentially as the gatekeeper to assure that the developers don't come in with a napkin and a drawing. There is a two-step process: preliminary plan review at the Plan Commission, and its recommendation goes to the village board for preliminary plan review. That means that they have not done final engineering, that they have not identified necessarily all the materials, but they have done enough architecture and design to give you a sense of what the building and the layout will be. So long as they are consistent with that initial conceptual preliminary approval that they would get from the village board, they take their time and do the engineering and make that more expensive investment in the final documents, and then they come back to the Plan Commission with a presentation on final plan review. You make your recommendations to the village board on final plan review, and that ultimately gets adopted. Along the way, you're going to be asked to make findings of fact twice, at the preliminary stage and at the final stage. And those findings of fact determine that they are meeting the standards or they're not meeting the standards. In some communities, the ability to deviate from underlying zoning standards is a variation. What a planned development ordinance typically does is give the authority to the village to vary without meeting the requirements of hardship. So you remember that a variation, which is stipulated by state statutes, means that there are physical conditions on the site which make it impossible, impractical, if you will, to meet the standards. That's called a hardship. The hardship can't be self-imposed. There's a whole series of things that limit what you can grant a hardship. But a planned development allows you to vary from the standards when they've done excellence in engineering and excellence in design without having to meet the requirements for hardship. Some communities will put a limit on how much you can vary, 20% or some number. And the last is, it's not uncommon for the project to get approved through its final development approval and something changes. And we have to have some in the ordinance how they can come back and receive approval of those changes. How's that?
There's a question from Trustee Clayton. Yeah, it's fine. Do you want to go to the microphone? Or either? Yeah, that one may work, hopefully.
I have the hearing aids in my ears too, so it's the only way I can hear. At what point can standards become too restrictive, either economically or legally, such that no development could meet the standards, or there's some legal thing related to property rights that gets us to a point where we've become so restrictive and so definitive that it becomes almost impossible to do a development?
The answer is there is, of course, going too far. And the question is, what becomes, you're essentially taking away all of the opportunities or rights of use of the property. I am not an attorney, but I'm about to give you an opinion. Essentially, you have to allow for a reasonable use of property. So the case law sets out a series of standards that have to be examined by the community, and they're built into your existing ordinances. These are the findings that you have for conditional uses, amongst other things. But essentially, it says if you're not allowing them to make a financial legitimate use of the property, you have taken their right to use the property. And you haven't compensated them for that. So how does that actually limit what we can do? They will, in the case of opting into a planned development, they will always have the ability to use it for what it is currently zoned. The planned development allows them to make use of it in a way that the underlying zoning would allow, but even potentially more so. The restrictions that might be imposed in terms of design still have to allow for the use of the property. I'm trying to develop a worst case scenario for you. If we impose densities that are less than what the underlying zoning are, they're not going to use the PD. So if the underlying zoning would say it's an office use, they have the right to use it for offices. But if the market doesn't support offices, they have to request a zoning that they can use, right? So that's when you often get a request for rezoning to some other use that might be residential. We have to determine whether the surrounding properties would support that use, whether it would be consistent or compatible with surrounding properties. At some point, the community would say, the surrounding uses are residential, so we have to allow for a residential use. How much residential? You wouldn't do it less than what the zoning would allow if they were using straight zoning. The height restrictions, the setback restrictions are not likely to be more restrictive. They are likely to be less restrictive.
Great. That's great. It's very helpful.
So clearly we have to come back with a draft, but I'm telegraphing the fact that we're going to rely on your early voting, early and often voting?
Wrong county.
Oh, sorry. And we will do our best to build in language that is defensible. That's all I can tell you.
I think we need to see a draft because it's theoretical until it's, and knowing what's going on in other places and what's been done and what's been creative and what's been not allowable. I mean, it would be helpful to know the whole spectrum of what the possibilities are.
As a suggestion, but to be careful with this so that there's no violation of the Open Meetings Act, if anybody wants to individually, not as a group, but individually, shoot me an email with some thoughts of things that you're thinking of over the next week or two. 1 comment, 10 comments, whatever it might be, different things that you think could be dropped into this ordinance that we could work with as far as either what the standards are going to be, what the bonus could be, type of thing. You know, I can collect that and then work with Lee and Attorney Hoover and start working up this draft ordinance. It would help. It would help. Because again, you know, this is really an attempt to have the community at large, with you kind of as those representatives, to give us feedback to how we're going to handle future development within the village. So hearing it from you is important to us. We can create whatever we want, but no offense, neither Lee or I live here in Riverwoods. You folks are all going to be living with it and seeing what happens. This is a kind of a unique opportunity to be at a cutting edge, even as far as being at the bottom rung of this ladder that we get all the way up at the top is approval by village board of the ordinance. We're somewhere down here versus up here, and this is a grand opportunity to get that input and be part of crafting future development. So individually, please.
Think in terms of your future self. You will want something that gives you backbone for your decisions. You will want it to allow for enough flexibility that great design will occur, but you also want to give some guidance so that you don't have to come up and develop it or prepare the design for the developer. You want to give the direction. These things are consistent with the standards of our community. And you may not always be in that seat. So this is your opportunity to give guidance to fellows who will succeed you.
I have a question. I guess it's the ordinance that they used for Thorngate, which we were given a while back. Would any of this be used as a template for what you would come up with for a draft, or is this, and the reason I bring it up is I've read this, there were a number of items that I really liked, and so, you know, what you have asked for, Steve, I can certainly put in an email, but would this be
It's fodder. Yeah, it really, look, I have to say nice things about it because the founder of my firm wrote that. But beyond that, I think that it addressed the issues that were relevant at the time. But then again, the technologies have changed. The standards for our concern about stormwater and all kinds of things have evolved.
Including lifestyles
And
the age of the population and everything else. So today is not what it was like when Thorngate was actually under consideration and under design. So there may be a lot of great things in there that we can work into it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be identical to what you're seeing there.
Yeah, but please highlight the ones that you really like.
Yeah, if there's something that you think is good, is a good starting point. I think that when you draft it, look at the more progressive or sensitive, environmentally sensitive communities that maybe are doing something creative that we should be thinking about adopting, because we are unique, and so some of those communities might be helpful. If there are such things, I don't even know.
No one is as unique as Riverwood.
I'm sure that's true. Thank you. I think that was very helpful, and I look forward to getting that draft ordinance. I think it's going to take us a little while because it'll be pretty complex, I think, but it'll be worthwhile, a good exercise. Are we ready to move on to the staff report? Unless there's any other, does plan commissioners have any more comments, thoughts, directions?
Okay.
Okay, staff report, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, some updates. Not a lot of new things happening, but I'll go through the ones that were still relevant from the February meeting. Brunch Factory, we have received a summary of traffic issues from the attorney representing the Brunch Factory. It's absolutely not what we asked for. We asked for a document prepared by a traffic consultant, somebody who does it as a profession instead of an attorney that's trying to just document numbers of parking stalls. It doesn't go into the flux of patrons coming and going within the center. So Attorney Hoover has contacted the attorney that put it together and let them know, or reiterated what we're looking for, and we're waiting for a response. I think we just got that about a week and a half ago. So there's some movement to it that Brunch Factory is trying to carve their own destiny here, and we welcome that. We just expected a document that was a little better than what we received. Camp Bow Wow, no update, haven't heard a thing. I think they're still in a mode that they're waiting to see what happens with the Deerfield Road expansion. Baby Vegas, had a long conversation with one of the representatives from Avalon. They've expressed a clear desire to work with the village to make all the projects at the two centers code compliant and work with us and looking to develop long-term relationships, which is a welcome effort. To that end, we had a permit application for the Baby Vegas space to split the old electric service that serviced the Panera Bread space. Because if you don't know, Panera Bread was actually 3 tenant spaces. Baby Vegas is taking the north, and then the other 2 excuse me, the other 2 are vacant and looks like it'll be vacant for some time. So anyhow, we reviewed the drawings, and ComEd is scheduled to either be performing that work as we are sitting here or by tomorrow morning. So I was told it's either tonight or tomorrow morning. So we'll take a look and see how that's going. So that is a good thing that they are moving forward with at least investing the time and money into that space, and hopefully we can get that thing closed out soon. The Orange Brace Road and Juneberry Road subdivision to combine the 2 lots and make it into 3. We've had no contact with the owner of those properties over the last month, so that's just somewhere on our docket. Walters Kluwer, nothing new to report. Federal Life, nothing really new to report other than we did meet with the potential buyer, and I think that they're kind of looking to see what happens with affordable housing and what the requirements are going to be. Other than that, it's out there. I have nothing else to report on it besides that. The home rental issue, I think, is going to be silent for some time. We have nothing new to report on that particular case. Sign permits. Attorney Hoover and I looked at a way to administratively review the Anytime Fitness sign. So that has been approved. I have not driven by in the last week to see whether or not they actually installed it. They've had it on site for weeks. I don't know if it's up yet. I think it'll be a good addition to what's out there. On the other hand, the SNAP Medical Wellness facility has made an initial submittal for their sign, and as part of the special use permit for that particular shopping center, they are required to come to this commission for a review of the sign. Right now, the sign ordinance limits the sign area on each face of the building to 100 square feet. Unfortunately, the existing signage that's out there is somehow well over 100 square feet, and they want to add. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of discussions they give us. And then the only other new one that we've got is the Riverwoods Montessori School has contacted the village for the second time in a couple of months. They're looking to construct a freestanding garage on the property. Unfortunately, in 1997, there was a special use permit that was granted for that particular property, and that permit restricted the number of buildings that could be on the site to the two that were there, the school building and the existing garage. So we'd have to look at a review of that with this commission and potentially look for an amendment to the special use permit. So that's all I have for tonight.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the director? Okay, thank you again. I have no comments, so I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Yes.
Things to think about. We were at Crunch Factory this
Okay.
week, and the owner asked me if anything had happened here in the village, and I said, we're waiting for reports. And he said the owner of the shopping center has filed a lawsuit against the IDNR for their taking of the parking places.
Right.
And until such time as that's settled, he refuses to allow anything else to be done. That's what he told us.
Well, potentially, and I've heard that. There are